Despite why companies struggle with recalcitrant IT.
It is supposed to be the Tesla killer.
It is supposed to be the Tesla killer.
Volkswagen's new ID.3 is the firm's first mass-produced
Volkswagen's ID.3 is the firm's first mass-produced electric car. Volkswagen's ID.3 is the firm's first mass-produced all-electric car.
And the first step in the German carmaker's attempts to reinvent itself.
And the first step in the German carmaker's attempts to reinvent itself for an electrified world, and the first step in the German carmaker's attempts to reinvent itself for an electrified world.
That makes it perhaps the most important model.
That perhaps makes it the most important model.
The original Golf launched in 1976.
Since the original Golf launched in 1976, that perhaps makes it the most important model since the original Golf launched in 1976.
The ID.3 is also late.
The ID.3 is also late.
Mechanically, the car is hunky-dory. But some software widgets that are a big selling point these days, rumored to include smartphone connectivity and augmented reality parking assistance,
may be missing at first, only to be added later. But some software widgets that are a big selling point these days are rumored to include smartphone connectivity and augmented reality parking assistance. May be missing at first, only to be added later.
originally set for this summer,
The launch has been pushed back until at least September. Originally set for this summer, the launch has been pushed back until at least September.
VW is not the only big company struggling to make its computers work.
VW is not the only company struggling to make its computers work.
Last year, British banks were hauled over the coals by regulators for online outages and botched IT upgrades. That left millions of customers unable to make or receive payments.
Last year, British banks were hauled over the coals by regulators for online outages and botched IT upgrades that left millions of customers unable to make or receive payments.
Some problems are much more serious.
Some problems are much more serious.
Boeing 737 MAX aircraft were grounded in 2019.
Boeing 737 MAX aircraft were grounded in 2019
After two fatal crashes caused partly by a software flaw.
Boeing 737 MAX aircraft were grounded in 2019 after two fatal crashes caused partly by a software flaw.
Investigators have since found lesser bugs. Airlines are, are, for instance, now advised to turn the plane off and on again.
Airlines are, for instance, now advised to turn the airplane off and on again
every 51 days to stop its computers
every 51 days to stop its computers
displaying false data in mid-flight.
displaying false data in mid-flight. Airlines, for instance,
Airlines are, for instance, now
are, for instance, now advised to turn the airplane off and on again every 51 days to stop its computers displaying false data in mid-flight.
advised to turn the plane off and on again every 51 days to stop its computers displaying false data in mid-flight. A similar problem found in 2017 in some aeroplanes made by Airbus. Similar problem found in 2017.
A similar problem found in 2017.
Some aeroplanes made by Airbus. Similar problem found in 2017 in some aeroplanes made by Airbus, Boeing's European rival.
In some airplanes made by Airbus, Boeing's European rival.
Prompted the European Union Aviation Safety Agency
Prompted the European Union Aviation Safety Agency
to require that such aircraft be rebooted at least every 149 hours.
Prompted to require that such aircraft be rebooted at least every 149 hours. A similar problem found in 2017 in some airplanes made by Airbus, Boeing's European rival, prompted the European Union Aviation Safety Agency to require that such aircraft be rebooted at least every 149 hours.
Blame for companies' IT woes often ends up in the boardroom.
Blame for a company's IT woes often ends up in the boardroom.
Sometimes that is fair.
Sometimes that is fair.
Dennis Muilenburg was rightly forced to resign as Boeing's CEO.
Dennis Muilenburg was rightly forced to resign as Boeing CEO
after the tragic 737 MAX disasters.
After the tragic 737 MAX disasters, Dennis Muilenburg was rightly forced to resign as Boeing CEO after the tragic 737 disasters.
But not always.
But not always.
For software is hard and hard to keep up with.
For software is hard and hard to keep up with.
And the employees expected to produce it are often the product.
And the employees often
but not always. For software is hard and hard to keep up with. And the employees expected to produce it are often the products.
And the employees expected to produce it are often the products of
a discipline that is in many ways oddly pre-modern.
That is in many ways oddly pre-modern. And the employees expected to produce it are often the products of a discipline that is in many ways pre-modern.
When software is eating the world, Silicon Valley speak for a situation where most firms are.
Silicon Valley speak for a situation where most firms are.
To a greater or lesser extent, software companies.
To a greater or lesser extent, software companies. That matters. When software is eating the world, Silicon Valley speak for a situation where most firms, to a greater or lesser extent, software companies, that matters. Start with the computer code itself.
Programming requires a mix of hyper-literalness and creativity.
Software requires a mix of hyper-literalness and creativity.
Tiny errors like a misplaced punctuation punctuation mark.
Tiny errors like a misplaced punctuation mark
Can completely change how a system behaves.
Tiny errors like a misplaced punctuation mark can completely change how a system behaves.
An industry rule of thumb is that depending on how carefully they work, programmers make between 0.5 and 50 errors
Programs make between 0.5 and 50 errors
in every 1,000 lines of code they write.
in every 1,000 lines of code they write. An industry rule of thumb is that depending how carefully they work, programmers make between 0.5 and 50 errors in every 100 lines of code they write.
Because cars and aircraft contain tens of millions of lines,
Because cars and aircraft contain tens of millions of lines,
the chances of an error-free system are in effect zero.
the chances of an error-free system are in effect zero. Because cars and aircraft contain tens of millions of lines, the chances of an error-free system are in effect zero.
The chances of an error-free system are in effect zero. Even when bugs do not lead to catastrophe,
Even when bugs do not lead to catastrophe,
they put a constant drag on a firm's productivity.
they put a constant drag on a firm's productivity. Even when the bugs do not lead to catastrophe, they put a constant drag on a firm's productivity.
Catastrophe. They put a constant drag on a firm's productivity. A survey commissioned by Stripe, a digital payments processor,
A survey commissioned by Stripe, a digital payments processor,
suggested the average developer spends 21 hours a week
that suggested that the average developer spends 21 hours a week
fixing old or bad code.
fixing old or bad code. A survey commissioned by Stripe, a digital payments processor, suggested that the average developer spends 21 hours a week fixing old or bad code.
The inherent difficulty of programming is made worse
The inherent difficulty of programming is made worse
by the shortcomings of software engineering as a profession.
by the shortcomings of software engineering as a profession. The inherent difficulty of programming is made worse by the shortcomings of software engineering as a profession.
These are laid out in a book, The Problem with Software.
These are laid out in a book, The Problem with Software.
Why smart engineers write bad code.
Why smart engineers write bad code. These are laid out in a book, Why the problem with software. Why smart engineers write bad code.
Engineering as a profession. These are laid out in a book, The Problem with Software. Why smart engineers write bad code. The author, Adam Barr, spent 20 years as a developer.
The author Adam Barr spent 20 years as a developer
For Microsoft, a software giant.
For Microsoft, a software giant. The author Adam Barr spent 20 years as a developer for Microsoft, a software giant.
Many coders, he notes, are at least partly self-taught.
Many coders, he notes, are at least partly self-taught.
That leads to bad habits which software engineering courses fail to correct. That leads to bad habits which software engineering courses fail to correct.
That leads to bad habits which software engineering courses fail to correct.
There is too little communication between academia and industry.
There is too little communication between academia and industry.
And no real agreement on what to teach or what habits to instill.
And no real agreement on what to teach and what habits to instill. There is too little communication between academia and industry, and no real agreement on what to teach and what habits to instill.
The result, argues Mr. Barr, is a field in which folk
The result
and still. The result, argues Mr. Barr, is a field
The result, argues Mr. Barr, is a field in which
in which folklore and fads too often take the place of professional standards.
folklore and fads too often take the place of too often take the place of professional standards.
Habits to instill. The result, argues Mr. Barr, is a field in which folklore and fads too often take the place of professional standards.
The result, argues Mr. Barr, is a field in which folklore and fads too often take the place of professional standards.
To illustrate the field's shaky foundations,
To illustrate the field's shaky foundations,
Mr. Barr points to the practice popular with technology firms
Mr. Barr points out the practice popular with technology firms
like Google or Apple
like Google or Apple
of giving job candidates a programming problem to solve on a whiteboard.
of giving job candidates a programming problem to solve on a whiteboard.
Few other fields behave that way
Few other fields behave that way
because they assume that by dint of having graduated,
applicants
have already achieved a basic level of competence.
applicants have already achieved a basic level of competence.
Doctors do not expect anatomy quizzes before being hired.
Doctors do not expect anatomy quizzes before being hired.
Doctors do not expect anatomy quizzes before being hired. Mechanical engineers are not required to jot down Newton's laws of motion to prove their mechanical engineers are not required to jot down Newton's laws of motion to
Mechanical engineers are not expected to jot down Newton's laws of motion
prove their bona fides.
to prove that their bona fides.
All those problems are compounded by software engineering's breathless rate of change.
All those problems are compounded
by software engineering's breathless rate of change.
by software engineering's breathless rate of change.
Even when a system works, it rapidly becomes obsolete. The woes of British banks are largely the result of trying to maintain such legacy systems. Written by long departed programmers,
often outsourced in half-forgotten computer languages.
To satisfy criteria no one can quite remember.
Coders under pressure to add nifty new features
Often cut corners, storing up problems for the ever less distant future. The result, says one expert with decades of experience, is that shiny new IT systems can rapidly devolve into rickety,
half-understood contraptions
held together with gaffer tape and a prayer. Eventually, the costs become too great to ignore, and companies must upgrade their systems. But that is the moment of maximum danger. For the new software must do everything that the half-understood old one does, and
because
more. Must do everything, but that is the moment of maximum danger. For the new software must do everything that the half-understood old one does.
Because the new software must do what half-forgotten old one does.
For the new software, their systems. But that is the moment of maximum danger. For the new software must do everything that the half understood old one danger. For the new software must do everything that the half understood old one does.
Because new software must do everything that the half forgotten old one does,
And more.
and more.
It is to repeat a common but apposite analogy,
It is to repeat a common but apposite analogy,
like rebuilding an aircraft in flight.
like rebuilding an aircraft in flight.
VW is doing its best to iron out the kinks
VW is doing its best to iron out the kinks
with the ID3's snazzy features.
with the ID3's snazzy features.
The firm wants to bring most software development back in-house.
The firm wants to bring most
Features. The firm wants to bring most software development back in-house.
the firm wants to bring most software development in back in house.
The firm wants to bring most software development back in-house.
The firm wants to bring most. The firm wants to bring most software development back in house.
And has spent €7 billion, that's $8 billion, on it back in-house. And has